Citizenship and belonging. We have 4 presenters: Robtel, Pailey, Jodie, Deborah, Adeojo, and Danille, Arendse, along with Fatima. For those of you who've been in this venue before, we've changed it up a little because our presenters want to see the presentations of others. So what may appear to be an absent set of people is not so. We're all here and we're very much looking forward to what people have to say. And afterwards we'll come up and I'll field questions and engagements with all of our presenters. And so with no further delay, Robtel, So because I've introduced everyone, you can all just come up. As someone finishes, you can come up once they're done. Is that fine? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It's really great to be at my first Afems conference. I was telling someone earlier, I guess it was yesterday, that I've been to many conferences. And this is probably the first and only one I've attended where the space is one of nurture. So thank you for creating the space. Today my presentation is entitled Women, Equality, and Citizenship in Contemporary Africa. And it's based on an encyclopedia chapter that was published a few months ago in the Oxford Encyclopedia of African Politics. And basically what I argue in the encyclopedia chapter is that women's citizenship claims pre-independence were basically sidelined by predominantly nationalist movements, right? Their citizenship claims were sidelined, they were deliberately silenced. And in the post-independent movements, women have been given more opportunities to state those claims. And those claims have been around citizenship rights, demands for citizenship rights, resources, and representation. And they're the 3 R's that I talk about throughout the presentation, with varied both successes and failures. So I'll walk you through the presentation, but I'll focus on representation as one that I think is incredibly important, because I think as feminists we need to occupy policy spaces, and we don't do enough of that. Okay, so when we think about the genealogy of citizenship, what immediately comes to mind is white, male, landed gentry. That's the image that we have of citizens. But I think if we insert conversations around race and gender, it forces us to turn that notion of the white, male, landed gentry citizen on its head. Feminists have particular understandings of citizenship that are very different from mainstream understandings of citizenship, right? So what feminists will say is that citizenship is historically male-centric, right? It's gender neutral, or supposedly gender neutral in its definition. But citizenship is actually differentiated by gender, it's differentiated by race, class, ethnicity. When we open up the conversation to include those social qualifiers. There's a feminist scholar by the name of Ruth Lister who argued that citizenship has a differentiated universalism. And what she means is that the universalism of citizenship must accommodate women's difference as well as their diversity, both in comparison with men, but also in comparison with other women. Again, introducing those different social qualifiers such as race, class, ethnicity, so forth and so on. Feminists also argue that equality cannot be equated with sameness. So when we're talking about citizenship equality, we're not talking about sameness. The fact of the matter is men and women are not biologically similar, right? They're not sociologically similar. They experience citizenship differently based on these social qualifiers that they inhabit, right? And women's experiences of the world, again, different from men based on these social qualifiers. Now, there are gender-inclusive definitions of citizenship that feminist scholars have come up with. And what they argue is to focus on 2 things. So this whole idea of status, citizenship is a status. And it's anchored in law, and that includes rights and resources, right? Citizenship rights and citizenship resources. But also agency, which is basically active political participation and active representation. But what's interesting is that although women have many responsibilities, have many citizenship responsibilities, and this can be in the private sector, the private sphere, They have few rights, fewer resources, and very, very little representation, particularly in the public sphere. Okay, what do I mean when I talk about rights, resources, and representation? So I argued earlier that in the post-independence era, women are given more opportunities to make these demands, valid demands, around claiming rights, resources, and representations. And that's a form of asserting their citizenship, right? Now, why is this and how is this, particularly in the post-independence era? There are a number of reasons. You've had domestic women's movements across the continent of Africa. You've had national constitutional reviews and revisions processes that assert female citizenship. You've had electoral quotas, which are problematic in some ways, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. You've had female labor force participation, active female labor force participation, and access to education, so that women are occupying the public sphere in a way that they didn't before. You also have shifts to multi-party democracy, and then successful political transitions after war, so in the case of Liberia, Rwanda, South Sudan. You've also had regional and global conventions and agreements, so everything from the Protocol to the African Charter on the Rights of Women in Africa to CEDAW. And then, last but certainly not least, you have feminism as a guiding principle for gender justice. Now, the question that I want to ask in this case study that I'm going to talk about is, do women's equality of citizenship improve with women leaders, right? I talked about the fact that it's important for us as feminists to occupy policy spaces, spaces of decision making. There's a whole range of literature around the fact that it's important for women to have descriptive representation, right? Numerical representation, that the more women you have in spaces of policy and practice, the better the conditions of women there will be. And we all know as feminists that this is not the case, right? So there's a difference between numerical and descriptive representation and what some scholars call substantive representation, right? Representation that actually enables the material, political, social conditions of women to change based on this type of representation. So I'm going to do a case study on Liberia because it is a case study that I'm most familiar with. I'm from Liberia. And how many people are familiar that Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was the first female elected woman head of state in all of Africa, right? She won a very unprecedented race in 2005 against soccer star turned politician George Weah, right? And it was an amazing feat that a lot of us looked sort of from the outside in, thinking this woman is actually going to make a difference because she ran on a ticket of women's empowerment, right? What I argue is that context matters, that this basically changed the political landscape of Liberia in terms of the symbolism of having her in office. I also talk about her accomplishments and failures as it relates to women's rights and women's equality. And then I'll argue, last but certainly not least, that she basically was a femocrat, right? That her actions generated both feminist and anti-feminist outcomes. Now my presentation is based on first-hand account. I worked, every time I look at this picture I laugh because it's a younger, more stylish version of myself. I worked directly with President Sirleaf in my mid to late 20s as a mid-level aide. And what was interesting to me is, again, occupying this space made me realize that there aren't enough feminists in these spaces. And decision-making is really based on masculinist outlooks, right? Even by women leaders themselves. And I'll talk a little bit about this in terms of her positionality. It's also based on scholarly analysis. I've written a number of book chapters, as well as this encyclopedia chapter, investigating her, whether or not her presidency was really a patriarchal presidency, right? And whether or not it actually engendered feminist outcomes for women. It's also based on popular commentary. There's a feminist activist friend of mine by the name of Porto Williams and I who wrote a piece in Al Jazeera entitled, "Is Liberia's Sirleaf Really Standing Up for Women?" And this article was published on the heels of her leaving office after 2 terms, after 12 years in office. And it came out of a discussion because towards the end of her office, there were a number of women who were running for both the legislature as well as the presidency. And she was lamenting publicly about the fact that there were so few women in elected office. And it incensed me and Porto, because the first question we asked is, well, what did you do to position women to occupy these spaces of power and influence in the public sphere. And so this article came out of that anger. Now, you probably know at that point I had left office. I was no longer working with her when this article was published. So I'd like to tell a story. There was an event that President Sirleaf attended, the International Peace Institute in 2012. And she tells a narration, and she says, there's a story about a young boy, and he's in school. I think he's in about 6th grade. And his teacher asks all of the students in the class to identify what they want to be when they grow up. What are the aspirations that they have in terms of professional aspirations? And she comes to the young boy and he says, oh, I want to be vice president. And the teacher says, well, that's interesting. Why do you want to be vice president and not president? And he says, president? You want my friends to laugh at me? That's women's work. And the reason I tell this story is because, again, in terms of the symbolism of having her in office, it really changed the psychological makeup of how people think of the presidency, right? It's not, because of President Sirleaf's 12 years in office, it made people realize that this is a space that women could actually occupy, right? That they could actually win elected office and do relatively well. Now, 2005 was a watershed moment for Liberia, right? She defeats 21 male contenders. She's the only one in a field of 21 male contenders, including Jodie, as I mentioned earlier. At this point, women voted in record numbers. I mean, I think the percentage of women voters was over 70 or 80%. She wins in a second race in 2011 against Jodi's party. And as a result, what I argue is that she follows a long lineage of women leaders in Liberia, right? She basically stands on the shoulders of other giants. And I think it's important to mention that because we often think of these moments as unique, right? That they exist in a vacuum. And they don't. In the case of Liberia, there's a long lineage of women who've occupied spaces of power. Ruth Sandow Perry, who was the first head of the transitional government during the armed conflict in Liberia. You have Angie Brooks, who was the first African female president of the UN General Assembly. So President Sirleaf really stands on the shoulders of these women, even if she acknowledges that or not, right? And because of her presidency, again, it really changed the role of women in particular society, both the private as well as the public spheres. Now, between 2005 and 2017, during her 12-year term, Liberia basically became the poster child for women's empowerment. You know, we had the election in 2005. Liberia in 2009 hosted the first International Women's Colloquium with Finnish president, who's also a woman. President Sirleaf wins the Nobel Peace Prize for advancing women's rights. She also wins the 2018 Ibrahim Prize after she leaves office for the achievement in African leadership, again, based on her advocacy of women's rights. But as Philomena Steady argues, women's political leadership does not necessarily guarantee advancements in pro-women policies or practices. And Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is a classic example of this. So there are a number of women-specific achievements that she was able to push forward, right? So she appointed a number of female superintendents and cabinet officials, unprecedented numbers. She also, in terms of her economic reforms, she increased the power and visibility of the market woman, right? The market woman became the human face of her presidency. She renovated markets, included literacy training in these market renovations. She gave market women access to capital through bank loans, safe storage, banking, so forth and so on. In terms of her social legal reforms, as we all know, there are lots of regulations on the books that are supposed to protect women, that are supposed to give women these rights and resources. So she enacted an anti-rape law, which had never been enacted in Liberia before. There was a national gender policy, so forth and so on. She instituted a gender-based violence unit within the Ministry of Gender. And then she also renovated Criminal Court E, which was specifically used for fast-tracking gender-based violence cases in Liberia. There were also women-specific failures, right? Even though Criminal Court E was renovated, it was based primarily in the capital. So it gave very few rural women access to this criminal court. And despite the rhetoric of women's empowerment, the representation of women in political office actually was very low. If you look at the numbers, the number of women elected to office when President Sirleaf became president in 2005 has actually dwindled. It's more than, I think in 2014, there were 3 out of 30 women elected to Senate. The numbers have gone down drastically in 2017, 2018, and 2019. So the question that we have is, if her presidency was based on a women's sort of empowerment presidency? Why is it that the number of women in political office has actually gone down in the past 12 years? What was interesting to me is, after I left office, is seeing the number of unequipped, underqualified young men who had been my colleagues when I worked for her, being appointed to really prominent roles in ministerial posts, right? So the finance ministry was occupied by a young man who had no experience in commerce at all, right? The agriculture ministry, the justice ministry, the youth and sports ministry. In her second term, a lot of these strategic positions that have been occupied by older women, technocrats, who actually had the expertise, were now occupied by men who had no expertise or experience whatsoever. Again, the question is, why is this, right? So what are some of my observations based on this analysis from the first-hand account, the scholarly analysis, as well as the public commentary? That President Sirleaf was basically a Femocrat, not a feminist. Amina Mama wrote a really important essay in the 1995 African Development article where she argues that feminism in the political sphere attempts to shatter the political glass ceiling, whereas femocracy keeps it intact, right? What was interesting is in a Guardian article in 2017, at the tail end of her presidency, President Sirleaf publicly denounced feminism as extremism. Now what's interesting for me is her predecessor, George Weah, has now appropriated feminism to the detriment of women. He calls himself a feminist in chief, while meanwhile advancing very masculinist sort of leadership style, right? And if you look at his cabinet, there are only 2 women ministerial posts. And one of the women is a minister of gender, and she's been a partisan member of his party for a number of years. The other minister is a minister of health, a very apolitical kind of position. It's more technocratic, right? So this man is calling himself a feminist in chief, meanwhile appropriating feminism to do a lot of damage to women, both in the political sphere as well as the social sphere. Porto and I often claim that because of our article in Al Jazeera, the president did a 180. She eventually argued that her presidency did not do enough for parity during the 12 years in office. And what we've learned is that electing a female head of state is futile if the person is not committed to a feminist agenda at the political, socioeconomic, and sociological level, right? So some of the conclusions that I've drawn is that fighting for citizenship equality, the rights, the resources, and the representation is really fundamentally about ensuring justice, right? It's more than just the procedural rights that we should be pushing for. It's more than just the procedural resources of representation. And there's a quote by Lewis that I'm going to read because I think it really sums up my argument around this. And Lewis argues, rights have leveling and universalized legal meaning. Justice, on the other hand, is far broader and implies a holistic understanding of ways in which certain groups and institutions can prevent others from realizing their different liberties. Through rights discourses, gender mainstreaming consequently constructs universal subjects as passive recipients, impedes their agency in driving change, thereby foreclosing possibilities for them to drive alternative gender transformation in society and privileges, the subject positions of globally and regionally dominant subjects. So again, we as feminists, I think, when we're talking about particularly the political sphere, is more than just, citizenship is more than just, again, pushing for equality of access to rights, resources, and representation. What we really should be talking about is pushing for gender justice at all these different levels of influence. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to an engaging conversation afterwards.
Hello, greetings everyone. Hi. Thanks for coming to this talk, and thanks to the Art and Our Mind team for all of these things, the top behind the scenes, and also the other members of this, other presenters in this talk who are really cool, and I'm honored, and you've been in the game, and I'm honored to be sitting with you. My name is Jodie, and I'm an art history and visual culture student at the university shamefully known as Rhodes, and I'm presenting my unfinished honors paper. In my presentation, I'm seeking to explore how creative methodologies within Black feminist paradigms manifest in local contexts surrounding women and their relationships to land. Through a textual analysis under Black feminist and eco-feminist lenses, I intend to contribute to any project interested in or attempting to manifest or create African feminist epistemologies surrounding women and their heterogeneous relations to land. That is in the connection between feminism as an academic discourse and the lived agentic experiences of women outside the academy, as they're indelibly linked in a synthesis of what can be called theory-praxis. The research particularly concerns land in our moment of climate crisis hysteria, which Patricia corrected us yesterday and said it's not climate crisis but corporatized crisis, which I think is the subtext of this research. Through tracing a brief history of women's relations to land issues, I seek to position the roles of women within Black feminist paradigms. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'm focusing on certain points of my essay that I think speak more to the theme of this talk. I'm going to see if you can eat them. Can plant them. It is true that the poor of the world are those who suffer the most grievous effects of climate change. Take the region of Bundelkhand in central India, for example, where 350 to 500 millimeters of rainfall were recorded annually over the last 5 years. This was in 2008. A decrease from 1,000 millimeters annually. In addition to the decrease in rainfall, the majority of whatever rainfall does occur is concentrated in fewer days and results in intensive flooding. Jaisalmer, a town in Rajasthan, normally receives 165 millimeters, but in 2005 it was reported that it received 141.1, resulting in the state government declaring drought. In 2006, Jaisalmer received 411 millimeters of rainfall, 207 of which came during a 3-hour period. Villages were submerged and millions of people were affected. So this is what climate change looks like, and it serves to remind us that the effects of climate change are not coming into the future, but they're happening right now. Climate change is also the mass displacement of people. Every push for the mining and production of fossil fuels is displacement of people. And we cannot discount the violence that have come with that, systemically enforced by our lifestyles, our education system, as Sylvia stated in a talk in Berlin last year, it is an illusion to think that we're removed from this global assembly line. It is an illusion to think that because we are not in those places, and those conditions of people who are subject to labor conditions within slavery, we are not affected by it. We have to confront the disturbing and unfair truth that our comforts and well-being stem from and depend on the suffering of other people. In speaking of creativities within Black feminist paradigms, the concept of materiality in feminism is crucial to the analysis of what constitutes creativity. Who wrote this? It is also essential to think about when speaking of land and women, especially the supposed treachery of the conflation of the categories of women and nature. The conflation of women and nature has historically been a site of misogynist rhetoric, constructing a docile, passive view of women on one hand and a nurturing, feeding caregiver and the passive and gender view of nature on the other. The rhetoric surrounding the connection between women and nature has predominantly playground various misogynies have relied on liberal environmental feminists as essentialist. Donna Haraway illustrates through a very fascinating and confusing account of the formation of mitochondria, which I believe are sorry science people, oxygen using organelles with respiratory enzymes which integrated into membrane structures. And this formation was mimicked in the modern, it was the same process as the modern cell as we know it. Cells evolving within other cells, basically. In this description, she is illustrating the point of how heterogeneous associations at various levels of integration are life-supporting and life-sustaining. And women, how are we any less? Haraway says that nature's constitution, as other in histories of colonialism, racism, sexism, and class domination of many kinds, has created the understanding of it as a repository of unchanging truth of substances. And she suggests that it is rather an active, transforming, signifying, gentle force. And once we begin to understand it as that, we can understand the most powerful parallels between woman and nature, the struggles of both experience. She suggests that we need to find another relationship to nature, besides possession, appropriation, and nostalgia, which one of the indigenous cultures are favoring. Shamim Mir's work focuses on women's land rights and authority in South Africa, and in researching the Namakaland colored rural reserves, through a series of participatory workshops, meetings, and discussions with women of these villages, she focused on discussions pertaining to women's roles, access to authority, and control over resources. And in this region, she found that it was inhabited by hunter-gatherers around 5,000 years ago. This area currently falls within the northern Cape Province. Most of the inhabitants today rely on employment in the mining sector for survival, with farming as a secondary activity. From historical accounts, it is presumed that 2,100 years ago, pastoralists, Nama-speaking Khoi, lived here in groups under the leadership of captains. And it was commonly understood amongst captains that grazing land, grain, and other resources were shared by all. There was little to no competition because the land was so sparsely populated. From the 1600s, European travelers entered that region and posed no threat to the resource base of the people, but they were dependent on the Khoi for supplies of meat and other food. In the 1700s, Trekboer, or colonial pastors, entered Namakaland, and despite their encroachment, also posed minimal threat to people's movements and access to resources. However, it was around the same time that missionaries began to enter Namakaland. These missionaries were responsible for drastically altering the lifestyle of many indigenous people. They attempted to limit their nomadic lifestyles, encourage cultivation of crops and upland settlements. Mission villages were established surrounding occupation areas. In these mission villages, Christian notions of a woman's role and her relation to a man and family were shaped the form of their settlements and framed women's roles in agricultural ties. Women played an important role in our society. Historians have emphasized women's central roles in socio-economic structures. The elder sister was a particularly revered role. To her was left entirely the working of her house. The status of women was high in the economic field. Nice. The status of women was high in the economic field. This was reported from research around the 1860s. She controlled the milking of livestock and all its products, and she had access to private property. It is said that the highest oath a man can take was to swear by his elder sister. And should he step out of line, she would walk into his flock and take his finest cows and sheep. And there was no law that prevented him from doing it. The position of women among the Nama was by no means that of the devoted servant to man. In the political domain, women were at a disadvantage. They held office very infrequently and were not reported to have been members of the popular assembly. It wouldn't be accurate to say a woman occupied inferior status to a man, but it does follow that women and men were not equal. Both occupied different roles and status. To cut a very long story short for the purpose of this presentation, the impacts of the mining industry were erosive and destroyed the traditional economy. The discovery of minerals in the 19th century brought settlers who pushed them quite further and further north. The action of the state and capital contributed to a breakdown of the traditional economy in which women played a central economic role. This was where women's status and roles were drastically impoverished, in accordance with Victorian Christian notions of a woman's place in home. Yet, women are resilient. They produce 60 to 80% of food in households today. They provide 90% of household water supply. Women in sub-Saharan Africa provide at least 70% of field labor. Yet they do not own the means to food production and are often the ones who feel the impact of food insecurity the most. Here lies my interest and confusion in how women's reproductive labors are neither counted as real or worthy of value. Women's reproductive labor includes activities such as cooking, cleaning, rearing of children, sewing, ironing, thinking of what is to cook and store to last till the end of month ends, what clothes will keep you warm when you step outside, what soap to use on your skin. And here's what I'd like to argue for. Women's creative, pleasurable, aesthetic means of survival. Women's reproductive labor encompasses creativity. Creativity is instrumental in both survival and resistance. I use the example of the Ndebele women painting their houses. In my Ndebele culture, women have the responsibility of painting houses. Of painting the house. In the late 1800s, when they were defeated by the Boers, they were subject to a kind of indenture system. They were split up and restricted from communicating, and languages that the Boers didn't know were threats to them. And so women would paint their houses with particular symbols that communicated different values and events. Prayers, marriages, initiations, meanings that other Ndebele would understand just from walking by the house. And in our Western perceptions, one could argue that this is mural art or graffiti. It's actually largely neglected by art history. Sabine Marshall speaks about Ndebele art's powerful political role in struggle against oppression in the 1980s, giving the example of a house painted in ANC colors, yellow, green, and black, with a black woman actually painted, but represented by the open door space of the dark space of the open door, expressing both her self-awareness and an awareness of the Western other, drawing power from that knowledge and imperceptibly inserting herself into its history as a political actor. In this essay, I used Beth Abrams' Pailey brand as a case study for how creative methodology manifests in looking at the aesthetics, functionality, and art making fundamentals she makes. So, I want to find out how she herself engages feminist discourses of soap making, in teaching her soap making to other women. And as she puts it, reclaiming indigenous knowledge, and how her getting back to nature is as powerful as mitochondria. What I'm also trying to do is show how this disjuncture between art with a small a, art with a capital A, creeps into the discourse surrounding these creativity. creativities in the way that these creativities are not recognized as art making, and also how the art embodies these status. What Event is doing is important work with intent and responsibility. It is serious work. The Marxist art historians are very accurate in saying that there is no such thing as artistic genius. They talk about the way art is the system that commodifies creativity, how artistic specialization comes from this capitalist division of labor. They say there are no painters, only those who engage in painting among other activities. Everyone has some kind of artistic ability. Many of us have grown up with these creativities. Others knitting, others cutting flowers, making fairy trails in the garden, cutting out bread, shapes. The way we look at art making is too narrow, and at least under our kind of and then the last thing, Lara a conversation, where she talks about the etymology of the word civilization in Yoruba and Latin. In Latin it means city, and direct translation from Yoruba means widening of eyes. So when she speaks about the theorizing from consciousness of what is beneficial to us as human beings, I think this is a great example of our vastly different worldviews of those European ideas and practices we've come to privilege. And it makes me think of our need to think more about ourselves and from ourselves. And I hope that my research encapsulates this. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Hello, my name is Deborah. Adeojo from the University of Ibadan.
Like 2 seats down.
And yes, I came all the way from Nigeria to this conference. Who kept asking me, you came all the way? Yes, I did. And I was told that I missed winter, but it's still very cold. Very cold. Okay, so this paper I'm presenting is on women's political communication and reconstruction of feminist geographies of power in Africa. Insights from Wives on Strike. So Wives on Strike is a movie, a Nollywood movie. How many of us have heard of Nollywood? Yes. Okay. So how many of us have actually seen any Nollywood movie? Okay. So Wives on Strike is a movie that was, it's in 2 parts. It's a 2-part movie. Well, the first one was produced in 2016, and it centers around the struggle of 4 local women concerning the issue of child marriage. And the movie was shot at the point where there was a debate at our Senate, the Nigerian Senate, about child marriage. Actually, there are some conflicting issues with our laws on child marriage or whatnot. Certain inconsistency. For example, we have the Marriage Act of 1990 that states that the minimum legal age for marriage is 21. Then we have the Child Rights Act 2003 that states it's 18. Then there was a bill that was going to be passed in 2015, putting a sexual offences bill saying that the age of consent is 11. That was in 2015. It was a bill. And even while we have the Child Rights Act, 12 northern states that are governed by Sharia have not included that act in their own legislation. So this movie came out around the time when that debate was still on. And basically I have my background in communication, and I just started my PhD, just started, in gender studies. So what I'm trying to look at really is women's political communication. How do women communicate politically? The truth is we're surrounded by communication. A lot of times when we think of communications, there's a tendency to want to see it as the verbal or the written or what the media releases and whatnot. But look at this room, we're surrounded by communication. Just looking at me, I am communicating something to you, even if I say nothing. If I come here and I'm jittery, touching my hair, I'm communicating something to you. So we're actually surrounded by communication. And so it's important for us to actually look at how we communicate politically, and particularly how women do that. I want to play some excerpts from the video. It's about 5 minutes long. No, I'm not going to talk too much so that you can engage me. So let me just play the excerpts and I'll tell you about the movie. It's in pidgin, so but you can read this one.
She said, Governor, won't carry on now. Give one a large. Make it go with the wife. I must say, make her talk to me. She said, make I beg you. Then you get down talk to Governor. This kind of thing will be happening. Mama, you say no. Because of this, because you don't understand it. I mean, I wouldn't marry in out of that age, getting no reason. I would like that keep my mouth for the woman on Sunday. It might be 13 years. Because I won't come there and go give you one. Make you marry him. When you say you won't consent you.
Okay, so that was the scene where Mama Ngozi was trying to convince her husband to talk to their neighbor, who is actually her friend, about not giving her their daughter in marriage to an Alaji. But the man was like, I can't do that. He's the head of his home. I can't interfere. So this is Mama Ngozi and her friends. They're talking about the child marriage issue, the one that concerns them in particular. And here, she's telling her husband, she's telling her friends that when you beg her, you beg her, so making you have me talk about that, you agree. You know, that's it. What you want? I don't strike. Yes. Which kind of idea? Okay, so for this woman who is in this kind of relationship, in this kind of setting where she doesn't have much voice, there's not much she can do, her own way of resisting, her own way of protesting is to go on a sex strike, denying her husband sex. And you may not see that as communication, but it's actually some form of non-verbal communication. There is in non-verbal communications, there's what we call haptics, and it's the use of body language, really. So this is something you can actually explain as a non-verbal form of communication, that I am protesting. So my way of protesting, if I can carry placards in the house, if I can't pressure you by making my thoughts known, I can as well use my own power and deny you sex. So these women got together and they all agreed that they would go on a sex strike.
Like your back. I hear your back. I suppose you look at you. You said, what's with it? I said, you never married. And then you go. And I married.
And this brings to mind the reality that even when you're not in a position to be a part of the protest like so, you can also show support, because here was a single lady saying, I support you. How are you supporting? You don't have anybody you're denying sex. But just affirming that I am part of whatever it is that you're doing, that kind of solidarity. So I think they actually invented the Wakanda thing. That's what I think. Okay, so this was the day of the child marriage. The marriage rights were already in progress, so they heard about it and they marched down to their friend's house to go and protest to kind of stop the marriage from occurring. Coincidentally, there was a press crew around the corner doing like a vox pop, and so they saw them going somewhere. It was fun. So that's the Elize, this is the father of the
What's going on here? Please tell these people to leave my way. Madam Speaker, someone from the wallet by this of our visitors! You saw me! This one are visitors! Send them visitors! Send them! Oh no! I beg your pardon, me? Jesus! Yes! Why should we go to the kitchen? If you're not being killed, why are you going to kill when you get here? What do you want to get? Oh! This is what you want to do! This is what you want to do! Oh! Madam, please, I'm responsible. Yes, you have nothing to do with you. You have everything to do with your home. This is your now. Yes, you want to know that.
So I think one of the things they are doing here is to take ownership of what is going on. Like, it's not happening to someone else, it is happening to us. That lady said, do you know how many times I bath? And this is what really happens, I think, in Africa, because it takes a village. There is no personal issue. Your issue is my issue. So whatever is wrong with you, there's a way I have to step in if I can. And so that's the kind of thing that they're doing here. So let me just move to this scene. Okay, so here, after the so in the movie, after the news was relayed on TV and they saw it, this particular lady here, she is the wife of a senator who actually belongs to the wing that was pushing for the bill, pushing for child marriage, because yeah, her husband belonged to that party. So she saw it on TV and she was like, she's tired of just being a senator's wife who does nothing, and so she wants to join this protest. So she brought these women together and put her on her show, interviewed her, gave them more visibility. And according to the movie, the strike went viral. Everybody started protesting, including sex workers. So there was no way for them to join her. And which is really important when we're talking about building a movement. Everybody has to be involved, and we have to find a way to get people involved in some sort of way. So it's a good movie. You should see it. It's in 2 parts. So let me go to my presentation now, which is really short. So I'm looking at women's political communication and the reconstruction of feminist geographies of power in Africa. There is this Western idea of thinking that power is hierarchical. Political power, for example, is hierarchical, that you have to really sit at the table. Yes, we want, like my sister said earlier, we need the visibility, we want the numbers at parliament. But there are women who will never get to the parliament. There are women who are really struggling with these issues. These issues, you know, there's a way someone in academia will talk about child marriage. It will be different from the way a local woman who has seen her friends give up their children in marriage will talk about it. So there's that. Do you get what I'm saying? Yeah. So, and most of the time, the people that are mostly affected by, the women who are really affected by these issues, they don't have the platform, they don't have the language, they don't have the space to really express what they feel. And so, I'm just trying to. So these are the questions that I'm looking at. Okay, so beyond sitting at the table as parliamentarians, political appointees, decision makers, etc. What other geographies of power can African women communicate politically from? How can women with limited education and political exposure challenge and influence governance and policies? In what ways can the ordinary feminist resistance of the everyday be harnessed to drive sociocultural and political change in Africa? If I don't answer all these questions, then you will answer them when you engage me. So what really is political communication? It is all forms of purposeful communication about politics. Really explaining what political communication is can be difficult because what is political? Let us try and answer that question. What I see as political is probably somehow different from what you see as political, depending on how you identify, your context, and so many things playing out. But all forms of purposeful communication about politics. So it includes the verbal, the non-verbal, the symbolic, the written. And it involves politicians, journalists, members of interest groups, and interestingly, private, unorganized citizens. There's a tendency to think that the people who should be communicating politically are those who are up there, those who are really in those known geographies of power. But unorganized citizens, we're all involved in politics because we are affected by the decisions, and so we're also political actors in our own right. And political communication is context dependent. It depends on where you are, the country you live in, the liberties you have, etc. And it's also influenced by the social categories of gender, class, etc. So Massey 2009 talked about space and power being intimately intertwined, and there appears to be places where power is concentrated. And really, when we think about this in terms of, you know, the House of Assembly, the Senate, the academia, there's some sort of power that is concentrated in these places. But I'm also coming up with a concept of power being domiciled in personal relationships. And in 2016, our president was in Germany and said that, okay, he was making a comment about his wife, and he said, I don't know what party my wife belongs to, but she belongs to my kitchen, my living room, and the other room. How many of us heard it? Wow. Okay. And the other room. And social media was on fire because everybody was, because everybody was really like reacting to it. But I'm looking at it from another way. Okay, so he said my kitchen. He took ownership of that space. He said my living room. He took ownership, but he said the other room. So it's like an open geography where power can be debated and contested. And that is a space, I think, in personal relationships that women, especially those who don't have a voice, can really contest power. So some of the insights that I'm drawing from this movie, the first is that the personal is political and the political is personal. So our lives are not in boxes. Everything is fluid, it's crisscrossing. Personal problems are political problems to which sometimes there are no personal solutions, but collective action is required for collective solution. Okay, so I'm out of time. The second thing is the language and forms of women's political communication must be expanded, especially if we're going to bring in women who don't have the social capital or the language or the platform to really express themselves. We have to expand how we see political communication. We have to expand how we think about women's political communication. And that's why I said that that sex strike, that kind of everyday normal resistance passes as some sort of political communication. The third insight is that women's political communication is effective with inclusive and engaging inter-feminist collaboration. And this is talking about feminist solidarity. What really made that sex strike productive in that movie was because it wasn't just one person doing it. It was a lot of people who came on board. And there's a way that women who have exposure and platform, they try to play this savior role in the lives of local women and women at the grassroots. I think it's something that we have to undo. These women also have their ways. We have to engage them. They have their ways of protesting, of resisting certain oppression. And we shouldn't bring our city and our academic and very theoretical approaches to tell them how they should fight certain things. We should learn. There should be a platform to learn and exchange ideas on how best to communicate on certain issues for effective outcomes. So the fourth insight is that the media is a powerful tool to be leveraged in building and consolidating women's political communications and movements, especially in amplifying muted voices. So a lot of times people want to rely on, especially now on social media, to start the conversation. the media is not always the place we start from. We should start from other spaces, from personal spaces, then amplify with the media. That's essentially what I'm saying. So with these few points of mine, I hope I've not been able to confuse you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's my first time at Afems. It's been lovely. Just to introduce myself, my background is I'm a research psychologist, and my background is test development, being critical of psychometric instruments used in South Africa. So that's the background. This project was with a friend, colleague of mine, just purely out of interest. So it's just something we're working on, and it's entitled "Where Are You From?" So it's reflections of us as colored, or so-called colored females. So just the scope in terms of what I'm going to speak about, just broadly a definition of what colored is defined as, why I feel the research is important, like basically set the scene for our study, a brief look at African feminism and intersectionality, which is how we framed our reflections, a narrative, so just aspects of my own narrative, and then concluding thoughts. So how colored is defined? So colored people are known as the offspring of slaves, and this is just varied. It's Indonesian, Malaysian, Indian, from Madagascar, East Africa, Nama, Khoi, Krikwa. As you can see, it's a lot with European settlers. The most important part of how colored people have been defined is from interbreeding. So white with black, or in that form, yeah, mixed. And the contentious racist category, or racial category of colored, has given way to a lot of stereotypes, negative perceptions, and it's prevailed, even though it was given during apartheid system for social control. And the experience of being colored, which actually makes up 9% in South Africa, in some situations gives way to minority experiences. So if you're outside of the Western Cape, you will feel like a minority group. And in essence, it's a social construction, which sometimes people don't realize, is that the actual category of colored it's a social construction made through apartheid government. And it's given way to oppression, shame, a lack of genuineness, and also silencing. So what do colored people look like? Just in case you didn't know. As you can see, there's really no homogeneity in how colored people look. They look different. They're not the examples of colored, they're just random examples. Some you might recognize. So why do I feel that this is an important area of research? Well, in the first part, I don't know if some of you have heard of the article that was published in February about the low cognitive functioning of colored women. Yeah, so it eventually got retracted, but those were one of the things that in 2019 we are still perpetuating certain kind of ideologies around the socially constructed racial group, because it's not actually a racial group, but we've actually internalized this. And the other things that were coming up in the media around colored people was that South Africa doesn't care about colored people. The sense of feeling like there's no care for them. They're not seen, they're invisible. You're not black enough, you're not white enough. This seems to keep on perpetuating through the years. And then also, the last one, we're also Africans. So almost being denied and being separated from an African identity. So an othering in a sense. So what is our study? It literally is looking at colored identity literature and reflecting on our experiences in our different locations. And when I say different locations, I was from the Western Cape. I relocated to Pretoria, and my fellow author was also in the Western Cape and relocated to Venda. So you can see very different narratives. And we used intersectionality in African feminism to almost think about our experiences. And this is really just some of it. And very broadly, just because I have to say something about the theoretical frameworks, which I think you probably all know much more. So African feminist speaks about African women and their realities on the continent of Africa. And since we are placed in this continent, it just feels like, why should we not include what African feminists have spoken about? It concerns how African women are subjugated and how they emancipate themselves. It strives for equity and justice and understands the impacts of gender, imperialism and race and the oppression it has had on women. And then intersectionality, there's a quote by Sylvia Winter which I think really speaks to what intersectionality is, but also about that colonial force. And she says, all our present struggles with respect to race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, the sharply unequal distribution of the earth's resources. These are all differing facets of central ethno-class man versus human struggle. And in essence, this is really what I feel. We are always battling to be more human, to be recognized as human in different spaces. And depending on how those intersections work, at some moments you'd have to almost justify your humanness. So intersectionality is an inclusive framework, and it really looks at all these aspects, how they intersect and how it has a symbiotic relationship. Because as I stand before you, there are many intersections going on right now as I stand here. So it's important to look at those intersections because they are also how we experience our world. And also what intersectionality speaks about is the multiple aspects of identity, and women's experience greater oppression in certain aspects of their identities compared to others. So in some moments we would be privileged and in others not. But the intersections of race, gender and social class are also ways in which educational and career aspects of women in South Africa have been impacted. And Mama proposes that in order to rethink power, we need to rethink identity in order to understand power more deeply, because there's a power in identity and how we understand ourselves in relation to that power constantly. So what is my narrative? So in the engagement with the literature on colored identity, I felt a sense of almost remembering and reconnecting, because it was years old literature, but yet I felt like I could relate very strongly with what these authors were saying 10, 15 years ago, and it was still very much present for me. So it was almost this reconnection for me. It affirmed some familiarities I had in the past, in my family life, and also in what I felt was our sameness in terms of me and my fellow author. And then in terms of intersectionality, I literally broke down my identity. So who am I? I'm female, I'm so-called colored, I'm transitioned from low to middle class because I'm working, I've educated myself, so now I've jumped in a social class. I'm Christian because your religion plays a role. University education plays a big part because now I'm suddenly moving into a class where people position me more powerful than I might think like low and identify more with those struggles, but I've been positioned differently. Heterosexual, and obviously that places you in a different category, and then able-bodied. So when reflecting on these intersections of race and gender, I thought of the stereotypical things about hair, body, and the type of things that I've heard throughout my life, and by fellow white and black people, and fellow colored people also. Your hair's bushy, it's wild, you have hips, you have big bums, and then at the same time, in my same features, the hair, the bum, the body, that was in one context too big, too bushy, was too straight, you're too light. You don't actually have a bum. So it also allowed me to see how sometimes your body is also being sexually objectified, and to think whether, is this in relation to me as a female, or is it in relation to me as a female colored? Has it some link to the identity and the stereotypes and the perceptions of actually being colored, the social construction that they've built up about how my body could also be sexualized? And it's obviously a subjective view, and I don't know. Have I also just been entrenched that I recognize it as that, as both? So these experiences and many other interactions with people have allowed me to identify with feelings of inferiority, oppression, shame, doubt, and also a lack of belonging. And it's also through these experiences
experience that I realized I also internalized my apartheid category as a signifier of my identity. And one of the examples was I was overseas and people were guessing where I was from. They're like, no, you're from Philippines, Malaysia, blah, blah. And I stood there and in my mind I thought, but can't you see I'm colored? And it was in that thought process that I realized, what had you just internalized about yourself? What had I been saying to myself that when I walk into a room, people automatically know I'm colored and there's certain things that go with that identity. So in a different space, people do not assign those things to me. So I've already assigned that internalized oppression in a form. And I was actually thinking that people should also see this, even though they were not from our context. So it was also the sense of actually wrestling with what I thought I knew as truth and what was actually the truth. But also these type of stereotypes and these perceptions, and in different cases, especially when you move out of the majority, where you won't feel it in the Western Cape, and you move into contexts where you are the only one, and people try and figure out, who are you? Where are you from? How do you place yourself? Because now you're one of very few colored, sometimes the only colored, and you've almost got to represent the race group, which is not even. So, exactly. So in those spaces, it gives way to what I felt was an other. You're just there. They can't quite figure you out type of thing. And this is where I also felt the need to actively dismantle those type of stereotypes, because the few that did sort of know you're gangster, you speak in a certain way, you're supposed to say aware and horse and all these things. Exactly. Those were the type of things people would throw at you, even in how they see you and their perception of you, because if you do anything that contradicts it, they can't quite understand what type of color are you. And if you're not light enough, dark enough, depending where you are, you're not assimilating properly. So those type of things, especially when you're outside of your context where there's a majority, that becomes to really, you start to wrestle with these type of things and how people have actually internalized this also. So it was things like the legitimacy of culture and language that were prominent features in defining your visibility and belonging, because colored people don't have a unique language. They don't have culture. So it's wrestling with those type of things when you're outside of your context, where you've almost got to dismantle what people have sort of learned generationally, because it's been internalized. And that was obviously why apartheid was so successful, is that we've still internalized and we're still trying to dismantle that internalization of who we think we are in relation to others. So I realized that a lot of people had internalized the stigma that I was experiencing, and this was from all facets, coloreds, blacks, whites, everyone. They had internalized this just like I had previously internalized it. I just had the fortune of actually wrestling with this thing of, but this is not real. It's not actually something that I am. So in many ways I felt that because not just us and me, everyone internalizes to some degree what we had internalized. It's also the rejection of this middle position. And I feel, especially when you're in certain contexts, you are placed in that middle position. Sometimes more verbally than not. And also the silencing of socially constructed racial categories like colored is where I found my agency and the need to recreate different narratives, things that had to contradict what people thought I was. The post-apartheid period has demonstrated that there are damaging internalized knowledges about colored women and just colored identity in general. And to me, this needs to be decolonized. That whole structure of thought and how we've learned to think about colored people as this type of people. Almost done. So in essence, the history, the culture, the stereotypes, the education, and the identity of colored people, there's common themes that emerge from this, and this is especially in literature, is there's feelings of inferiority, there's shame attached to it, there's doubting who you are, there's a lack of uniqueness that because you don't have what they call unique language or culture, because it's been erased, and oppression. And what the "where are you from" title speaks to is this lack of belonging, the sense that people have internalized this knowledge and they constantly perpetuate because no one is dismantling this system of knowledge. So through our critical reflections as being colored females, and I do this, we wanted to create a unique perspective on consciousness raising as we engage with our own different experiences of exclusion, being stereotyped, being marginalized, our perceived lack of belonging, the silence, and being invisible at times, and then also our agency in relation to these experiences. And it's hoped with this engagement that we break down colonial racial barriers, and that's what we hope to do, was just engaging with how colored identity is perceived as well as the internalized identity itself. And by incorporating the African feminism, which didn't come through very strongly, only the intersectional part, but I found that that allowed for a better understanding of our experiences and also for the dissecting of the internalized racial apartheid category that has become social, well, it was socially constructed. And thank you for listening.
Such an incredibly rich panel that I think it would be only fair to do 2 rounds of questions. I thought that, you know, there's so many common themes we have frantically writing, and to me, one of the big questions was, what are the responsibilities of women? I feel that's come out kind of across papers in this panel, both in terms of the kind of individual responsibility of a woman in a home, which I know a couple of you are very in homes, home spaces, but also in terms of the kind of collective responsibility of women and the complexity of understanding and thinking what is power in this context. I also think that another intersection was a kind of precarity, right? Precarity of being, like the title says, belonging. So precarity of being part of something, whether that be citizenship or a kind of sense of community across being a woman and what that means in a different context that you've all raised. And I've noted here something like citizens of somewhere, alongside promises of positions of power, right? And the illusion of power when power is embodied in a woman's body, what that might mean, which we know came out quite strongly as well. And then for me, something else that came up was this notion of trust. The idea of trust that we place in if a woman is in power. There's a particular kind of trust that is not the trust that we supposedly place in a man in a position of power. And again, that came out across papers for me. The woman in your, in the phone, in the clip that you showed us, there's something there about the responsibility and the kind of power that they invoke through their refusal, right? So there's also like those kinds of ideas. And then just finally to say that one of the very strong themes, and I thought that this was so beautiful, I don't know how many of you were in the panel before in the Graduate Center, but some have there noted the common thread of space, and space continued here. So that was just very interesting. And the kind of interplay, like I said, between individual spaces, private and public spaces. And also the thinking of thinking with space as something that is able to create new narratives and ways of being, which I think you also all bring up and which is bubbled up in different ways. So I don't want to hog the time, and I'd really like to now open it up to audience members. We have Joy in the back, and Kamalo? Yes. 3. So we have 3 now, and then.
Thank you very much, all the presenters for your beautiful presentation. My question goes to Debbie for that presentation. You both come from very strong hegemonic and patriarchal background. Now, that video slide was the last one, but my question is, how would religious women protest when they see issues they cannot manage? Because what you demonstrated, if as a religious woman, Christianity or the other one, you do that, you'll be rejected by your people that you are not submissive. And you are attacked. You are ostracized by your community. I don't know if you understand what I mean. If the pastor gets to hear that you did not give Budi show, you're not going to, if you hold an executive position, you're not going to officiate. I am one. So that's how I know they must not hear. Now I'm happy that I have the PhD, I have the voice. You hear, you know she's a doctor. That doctor thing gives me a voice. And we know that these things are true, they're existing, the oppression is there, it's continuous. So my question is, in religious settings, how can you, not religious settings, for religious women, how do you go about this protest? In practical terms, I was not allowed to play certain instruments in the church because I am a woman. This is happening till now. Now what I did was to, okay, then only the men will go to church if you stop me from playing. But it was extra work on me to be good in a particular area. And I watched the pastor here in South Africa calling the man to come and take my place. You know, I'm a doctor, so I said, Pastor, did you ask the pianist to play? In open church, and they know me. You see what I mean? Everybody like, you know she's a doctor. Now, if I know this doctor thing, it's going to be fight. I'm not joking. So what I did was, I did my strike. Quietly, I come to church, I go straight to the mic, no playing of the piano. Let the man play. But I knew I had something. He could not play what they call classical hymns. And the pastor was like, okay, Mama Young, we've been looking for you. Please come and play the hymn. I said, no. And then in Alice, I went to the keyboard and the man said, we don't see female pianists playing. You see that hegemonic? It's still there. So if you don't want to be rejected by your own people, I heard somebody asking my husband, how do you manage a wife who is a feminist? I'm serious. And then 2 days ago, somebody told, my brother-in-law said jokingly, you know, our doctor wife is a feminist. They don't marry. You see what I mean? And these are the challenges. I have chosen to fight all through until you leave me alone. I want to live my life. Now, how do we, religious, and it goes also for a woman that is a Muslim. I know of a PhD candidate who removed her hijab. She said she was told that she cannot do sciences, that she was not supposed to be. So she took off the hijab and said, no, I'm not interested in this. I must do what I want. Thank you.
Thanks, colleagues. Really fascinating presentations all around. My question is inspired by the work of Duzinas, when Duzinas talks about the 7 theses on human rights. And I'm curious whether, and of course he traces how it is that human rights as a category has always played a role in the exclusion of whatever identity, right? Whether it be black, whether it be female, whether it be queer, and this goes back all the way to Greek antiquity. We see it all the way to today, right? In South Africa at the moment, this question of rights is playing itself out in terms of women's bodily autonomy. It's playing itself out in terms of our fellow African neighbors, in terms of their citizenship and their belonging in the country, and subsequently their access to rights. So I'm thinking, is it maybe possible to radically reimagine categories of being and categories of personhood outside of this economy of rights and this economy of citizenship? Is that at all possible? And if it is, how do we begin to think outside of those categories? I'm curious.
Is that for across the panel? Okay, thank you.
I'm interested where to find your works, today's presentations, and maybe other works, just to engage with all of you. And
the seeds. I'm also, like, I made my own conclusion with the seeds, but I want to know why, what was the thinking behind sharing the seeds in the room that sparked my curiosity, and I kind of made my own private conclusions about it. They're all warm, so I'm keeping them, but I want to know your thinking behind it. And the last presentation about colored, I am always, and it's the same discussion sometimes in my head, even with Indians, like the big or black, where there's this conversation that I feel at times we are not having, because we are afraid of either offending each other or being cancelled. But in spaces, in workspaces and spaces around, there's a betrayal that happens when silence occurs, where my lived experience with color has been, we are cool as long as it works to be black at this time. And then when, excuse my language, shit hits the fan and you need to rise up. In the workplace, I've seen the colored people step back when they're supposed to be witness to something, do something. And this is my lived experience. And then the conversation then tends to become a little bit hostile at times, especially in academic spaces where my lived experience demands that we have this conversation, or to talk about this, to write about this somehow, but the space is not conducive. There are these, and a lot of times the language as well, where you've internalized things about coloredness. I've internalized things about blackness, being a black female supposed engineer in the predominantly white male Afrikaans sector, where things happen to all of us. So my question really is, how do we hold each other in the intersectionalities? How do we hold each other accountable and still show up for each other in different fights? And where is room for that without this hostility and cancelling each other? Where can we honestly come together and confront each other's silences, each other's betrayals, and each other's oppressions at the same time?
Okay, shall we take this round?
Sure. I'll answer the question about how do we think beyond citizenship. It's interesting that you asked that, because in my research and in my scholarship, I've come to citizenship as the lens through which I would actually engage. Because when you think about citizenship, it has a European sort of foundation, right? But I find that it can also be emancipatory, because particularly within post-war contexts like Liberia, we often think about wars as happening as a result of ethnicity or region or religion, very, very primordial. When I argue that it's really about citizenship, right? The idea that rights are rights, but they're also not absolute. My right to flail my arms in this chair stops at the point where it becomes uncomfortable for her. Where her rights start is where my rights end. You know what I mean? So I think, for me, I've reclaimed citizenship, even though it has a sort of European foundation, as one that I think we Africans should take on as a lens as a lens of analysis. What I like about citizenship is thinking about citizenships, plural, at these different levels. Like my presentation was very focused on the hierarchical, but if you read the encyclopedia chapter, I talk about citizenship at the very micro, macro level. And for me, that's a very powerful tool to use for this kind of analysis.
Okay, so to the question on the practical ways that women can protest in religious, if they're religious and all that, I agree with you, we're from the same context. So religion can be oppressive in itself. I think that one of the things that we should really work towards is story sharing, sharing experiences and community building, because there are too many things that we are trying to resist that too many people have resisted before. And so creating those spaces where we can talk about these issues and borrow lessons from one another can be very effective, like in practical terms, to how you go about your own form of resistance or politics of refusal. So I think that it's important for us to build communities. If you, in your own church context, I know that most churches have this women's fellowship. I know that some of those women can be instruments to perpetrate patriarchy too, but there are also other women in those systems, and I'm talking about this from experience. There are also women in those systems. For example, you had issues with being called a feminist. By the way, in our context, feminism, you can't just say I'm a feminist, because it comes, there are lots of, in the Nigerian context I mean, if you say you're a feminist, there are lots of meanings that comes to people's minds, and people shut you up and people think, oh, she's not going to get married and this and that and that. So there is that. But there are also people who are in the field like you, who are also practicing Christians, who have gone through the things you've gone through. So I think if we create communities where we can share experiences, it can help us in going about our own individual resistance. And I also think that there's always a way to find leverage, regardless of what relationship or what fix you're in. You have some form of power, you have some form of leverage. There's a way you can deny access to a particular thing and make everybody come around and say, okay, we can't do without her. Do you understand what I'm saying? So I think those are really practical approaches. Okay.
Hello. Can you tell me what you thought was maybe
About the seeds.
about this?
So, listening to your presentation, and I think I have this thing where I want to find, at times, in gestures of kindness or warm gestures, the meaningful or the sacred or the spiritual in it. And for me, it was just thing of, I don't know whether because you're a woman and you're sharing seeds and you're talking about art history, climate, and the place of women and how women have held space in different spaces. For me, it was the whole idea or message of planting something. Either, I don't know if it's gonna come across as offensive or what, you seemed very like free in yourself, which was kind of, for me, awkward in the space. And I loved how you embraced your awkwardness. And I thought, this is you being you in the room. And you are planting that seed of arriving authentically yourself. And how you did not stand at the podium or behind the desk, and you followed your seed. So you planted the seed and you kind of followed it everywhere. And in your own awkwardness and your own freeness. And for me, that's the seed that you were planting. But in addition, on the flip side, what you did was you said, you can eat them, you can plant them. So the sort of nourishing people with your own being and still giving them something to nourish themselves with their own being, like how we keep patching onto each other the way the roots would attach and grow. So
That's exactly. It sounds so nice. I think, well, you just made me think of it as a giving and kind of meaningful and almost spiritual thing. I think my intention was to share with you that you can take literally take something from whatever I was saying. I was very, very nervous. And it's another way, I think, of countering the really like rigid standing at a podium. You know, these things feel like exams or being in this lecture room type of thing. And feeling like there are other ways of engaging with each other, the same creative methodologies that I was talking about. That we can see speaking to each other, engaging with each other in different ways. And you can plant the seeds and you can get onions. Thank you for your question and everything.
I feel like I got the worst question. It's so difficult to answer. The question about being, and I think that I sort of just, this is my perception. It's obviously what I think for both of you, because I think they sort of interrelate. I think because the knowledge has been so ingrained through generations, and it's so internalized that you cannot always separate what is truth and what is not truth. And even like you say, your experience of being with colored people, even amongst themselves, sometimes, and this is from my own experiences in my life with family, with friends, is the commonality is sometimes just confusion. I don't know where I fit. I'm in this middle zone. And it's because it's been conditioned. And it's been conditioned so well, so perfectly, that it's transcended. And unless you become in a university space where you're allowed to think very critically and actually almost dismantle what you've been taught, then you can't really engage with someone that hasn't come to that space. That idea of, you know what, this isn't real. And when I say that, even saying university space, that also doesn't, because I had a colleague in two at that, master's educated in the same discipline as me. And the one question was, she had married a black man and they had children. And a friend asked, oh, so what do you classify the children as colored? And she said, no, they're mixed race. Colored is a racial, like that's a race group. And I was like, really? Because colored people aren't mixed. So for me, it was also what I realized with that and many other examples is that people have internalized ways of being to such an extent that they cannot separate it. And it really calls for really politically, because it's politically ingrained, it's a social control mechanism. It's to dismantle everything. It's to break down the system. And what it costs to break down the system, I have no idea. I think it's to start engaging in uncomfortable conversations. It's to really think about where are we positioning ourselves, because I think even as colored people, those that look very light, they assimilate to whiteness. And even amongst themselves, if you're a darker color, they have put your hairs, they will be critical of you as colored in the same category. So, and those that obviously that look more black, they assimilate that way because it's just easier. So those type of things for me is conditioned knowledge. It's not real, it's not truth, but it's become ways of being. And the only way I can think of is overthrow the system. And we really need to. I don't know how, but the only way I can think of in my agency is to dismantle what I think I know. And to try and create knowledges where we dismantle and question the very things that are supposed truths.
Okay, thank you so much for all of your answers. We're actually completely out of time. I know that Danille's colleague wants to just do a short comment.
I'm from rural local province. I'm the only Muslim colored female, and so when you talk about workspaces and you relate it to race, I want to throw it back at you because I'm in the department and I really want to fight for the empowerment and people's voices. And I've tried to engage my colleagues and say to them, come, let's activate and let's question what our institution is doing. The institution is really patriarchal. They top down, you must come to work at this time and leave at this time. And so I've tried to get my colleagues to have a voice. And at the times when we are in school board, I've often felt deserted by them. And so I want to say, I see you and I feel you. And I'm asking, is it about race or is it about finances? and not wanting to be seen in front as fighting for something. And the problem with colored identity is that during apartheid, colored people started fighting, and then something had happened. When I was reading up in the history, and the UDM and the ANC, they were fighting, and they stayed away from work, and then the colored people went to work, and I was asking, is it about being colored or is it about being poor? Because we can't stand away from the fact that people that have been oppressed are poor. And at the end of the day, you're going to want to give your child food. So is it about race or is it about being poor and oppressed?
In a moment of crisis, it becomes about race.
Okay, this is a huge. I think we need to wrap it up. Thank you so much for such a wonderfully engaged panel. Thank you for all of your